think the future holds for the development of iconic buildings?
Well, I think life would be sad without them, because they provide the highlights, and you need that to lift the spirits. I don't think you'd want to have too many of them, because that would be like eating chocolates all the time. You know, you'd be sick. But I think it's very important because they provide the architecture which reflects the culture we live in. And all great cultures and societies have had great architecture. And I think that's how I interpret iconic buildings, as great architecture.
What will it take to make a truly carbon neutral building a reality? Is it possible?
It is possible, certainly low carbon. We've already completed several buildings where we, for instance, don't take any energy from the grid. The building provides its own energy. And in order to do that, you have to have a very efficient building. You have to have low energy generally. You know, the enclosure has to be very efficient. In London, we just completed the Urban Sustainability Centre, which recycles all its own water. It creates all the energy it needs to power the building through geothermal power and photovoltaics. It's not easy because, but you have to push technology to the limits to do it. And in Singapore, we've done something more exciting than that, I think, which is to change the climate, substantially change the climate. So we've provided two very large glass houses in the tropics with Mediterranean climate in one, without using any energy from the grid. And that's pushing it. That's using mainly biomass and photovoltaics. So it is possible. I think it's a subject I'm very interested in because I think we have to make buildings more sustainable. We have to solve these problems of gas guzzling. Otherwise, we're going to become extinct.
I will, in that spirit, I will ask you one of the questions from one of the other question pools. Is that what is the next big breakthrough for tall buildings? Is it technology? Is it environment? Is it photovoltaics? What's the next big thing?
Well, I think tall buildings have a responsibility to reduce the impact on the environment generally. I mean, that's obviously difficult because they use a lot of materials, but in terms of the energy they require, I think you've got to use technology to improve the performance. And if you think of cars, and 30 years ago they used to do maybe 20 miles to the gallon. Now they do 50, 60, 70 miles to the gallon. It's possible. It's possible with buildings, and I think that's the way it's moving.
When we talk about special places, very unique places and buildings, tell me about the Atrium at Guangzhou Finance Center.
The Atrium at Guangzhou is an extraordinary place. It's because it starts on the 70th floor and rises up 33 stories above that. So it's tall enough to get St. Paul's Cathedral, including the dome, within the height of it. It has a very large glass roof, and the top 8 stories are glazed in for smoke reasons. It was a requirement of the fire department. And we've faceted the glass so that it's a little bit like a kaleidoscope in it. It collects the light and sort of sparkles in a crystalline way. And I think there's no point in having an atrium unless you make the best use of it, make it an exciting place to be in, really. And also to collect light. I mean, that's the basic requirement of an atrium.
What is the most livable city in the world? What are your nominations?
My nomination is London. And I'm enjoying it here in Shanghai. And I think it's a great city, very vibrant place. But what it doesn't have is the contact with nature. London still manages to provide this very fast, exciting, high-density city, combined with a lot of parks and landscaping. So you can, wherever you are in London, you can make contact with nature by escaping into some green space. And I think that's really important. Of course, having water is good as well. We have that in London. We don't make the best use of it. In Shanghai, of course, the water is a very, very important part of that. So it does have contact with nature, but there are places where you find it's a tough environment, and you want to see a few more trees.
I'll ask you to make an observation because one of the things that I find fascinating about Shanghai is the fact that there is so much space between buildings, and you can experience the full height of buildings much more readily here because they're not concealed by other buildings. And there are some green spaces from where you can do that. At least that's my observation in that it makes the urban environment here more interesting. What's your view of that?
Yes, I think there's a downside to that though, because if you have space between buildings, that means the buildings are quite a long way apart, and that means that getting from A to B becomes much more difficult. There's a logic to keeping buildings fairly tight, and you can walk between them rather than having to get a taxi. It's a bit odd to have to get in a taxi to go from one building to the building next door. And that's the sort of Los Angeles problem, really. It's too spread out. I would say that Shanghai suffers in the same way as Los Angeles, but it, it is fairly spread out. The center